As he stood on the deck of the British ship Vigo and silently watched his homeland disappear into the horizon, Francis Goudy must have wondered, am I doing the right thing? Am I being wise, leaving everything and everyone I've ever known for the unknown? Almost 130 years have passed since that 21-year-old farmer from a small borough called Sloanstown in County Down, Ireland, made his fateful decision to leave Ireland, this house that he was born in and where he had memories of his mother, Elizabeth Ann Reed Goudy, and father, William Goudy, and 7 sisters and brothers, Jane, Arthur, Agnes, William, Francis's twin brother, Robert, Nathaniel, and Elizabeth. Because of his courage and foresight, we are all here today reaping the fruits of his long, hard journey and his search for a better life. It is spring of 1860 as we begin our story. As the sea roils around him and the ship heaves, Francis is reminded of the great turmoil in the country he's leaving behind. In Ireland, his hopeless future promised only ruthless and intolerant landlords, low wages, heavy taxation, and famine. Where he is going, to the promised land of the United States, he will be free to dream again. One of those dreams is to become an Episcopalian minister. This is their home church in Ireland, where many of their ancestors are buried. The Goudys originally came from Scotland and then moved to Ireland. When there were battles between clans, and the Goudys joined in with a bigger clan called the MacPherson clan. The Goudy family crest is also the MacPherson crest. Engraved on the crest is "Touch not the cat but a glove," meaning touch not the cat without a glove. As the miles between them become less, Francis anticipates joining his twin brother William on the farm they will both work. As the ship docks in the New York harbor, he has already begun planning his future in Lillian, later named Stanton Township. Life in Minnesota will not be easy or predictable, he knows that. So far, William has amassed a personal fortune of $75. 2 years after Francis' arrival, William enlisted in the Minnesota Infantry, Company C, Regiment 6, and fought in the Civil War. He was finally discharged after 3 years of service as a private, returning to the farm with honor and a bad case of chronic diarrhea. In 1863, Francis met his wife, Bridgettina McWeeny, a 16-year-old Catholic girl who had just come to the United States from Cavan, Ireland, to live with her sister, Mrs. Hamilton Jackson, in Hastings. Much easier than they would have been allowed to do so in Ireland, they resolved their religious differences, and 1 year later, on January 24th, 1864, they wed in a beautiful ceremony at Gardner House in Hastings. It was to be a happy and fulfilling union that would last until Bridgettina's death, 1 week short of their 60th wedding anniversary. This picture is of Francis and Bridgettina's grandson, George Goudy, in front of the Gardner House as it looks today. Bridgie, as Francis lovingly called her, bore him 11 children on the farm where they spent their entire lives. This is the earliest picture we have of the children of Francis and Bridgettina. Only 6 of the 11 children are pictured here. Left to right, standing, are Robert, Marie, and James. Sitting are George, Elizabeth, and John. This family picture was taken years later at the wedding of Nathaniel and Emma Robinson Goudy on December 30th, 1903. Pictured are standing John, Francis, Marie, Robert, Nathaniel, James. Sitting William, Bridgettina, Elizabeth, Francis, and Arthur. On the floor is George.
And then one dark night, for it should never be there at all.
Only a chimney fire in 1887 marred the happy tranquility. It savagely destroyed the house and all its contents. But gathering up their strength, their friends and family, and their meager resources, they began again. This time, Francis made certain that a special fireproof chimney was designed for his new home. He was determined such a disaster would never be repeated. These pictures are of the second home as it looked and as it looks today. Bridgie took care of the house while her husband worked as assessor of Stanton and served on the local school board, holding both positions for 35 years. He also organized, managed, and was secretary of the Stanton Cooperative Creamery. Since education was such a vital concern to Francis, he even taught school for several years when teachers couldn't be found. Many of his students, eager to learn to read, write, and figure, were as old as Francis. But it is doubtful any of them could recite all 26 verses of the poem Over Yon Misty Moor as Francis did, to the delight and amazement of his children and grandchildren through the years. His devotion to the Episcopalian Church had never wavered, even though the doctors had persuaded him to replace his dream of becoming a minister with a more realistic one. Because of his ill health, he was advised to work outdoors in the fresh air. So with his characteristic gentle determination, Francis worked hard in other ways to better himself and his community. But of course, he was understandably proud when all his children were baptized by the first Episcopalian bishop in Minnesota, Bishop Whipple. Francis sent William, Arthur, Francis, and James to the Red Wing Beeman Actual Business College. This is a picture of Professor Beeman that the college was named after. This is where the college was. It is now a gift shop in Red Wing. He was also proud and considerably ahead of his time when he encouraged his daughters and granddaughters to attend college so they would always be prepared to find a place in the world as well as in the home if it became necessary. Francis' concern and generosity extended even beyond his immediate family. In 1907, he brought the David McCaig family from Ireland to the United States. Margaret Goudy McCaig was the daughter of Arthur, who remained in Ireland. He also brought two of Bridget's sisters and one brother from Ireland to St. Paul. He not only saw to the growth and nurturing of his children, but also his beautiful apple orchard. His beloved orchard was one of the things besides his family which kept him happy and cheerful even after he fell and broke his hip and became disabled. But not even the scent of the pink and white apple blossoms or the flavor of his favorite peppermints could have comforted him when he lost his cherished wife, Bridgie, on January 17, 1924, and then only 5 months later, on May 1st, his lovely daughter, Elizabeth. Francis died June 22, 1924. They are both buried at the Stanton Cemetery. William, their first child, was born on September 27, 1865. He was a sweet and easygoing child who grew into a sweet and easygoing man whose neat and well-dressed form and kindly high-pitched voice endeared him to everyone he met. He inherited his father's love of learning and attended Beeman Actual Business College in Red Wing, which prepared him for successfully operating the Seaforth grain elevator as well as a farm. William also became very successful as a husband and father after marrying Lily May Stigner in 1892. May, who was born on April 8, 1873, taught school before her marriage and raised her 7 children with loving skill and confidence. These children, Francis, Ruth, William, Esther, Gordon, James, and Robert, brought into their parents' lives much joy and pride, but also the great and everlasting sorrow that only the death of a child can bring. Their oldest son, Francis, died aboard a ship on his return home from World War I, and May, both honored and grieved, traveled with the other Gold Star mothers to France to visit his grave in 1930. Their son, William, served in World War I also. Their youngest son, Robert, was killed in World War II in 1944 and was awarded the Silver Star posthumously for his gallantry in action in Italy. Robert had served in the Red Bull Infantry Division of General Mark Clark's 5th Army and had led his platoon in the capture of 40 Germans. He was fatally wounded while leading an assault on enemy positions. May died of lung cancer that same year, April 12, 1944, and is buried at Redwood Falls Cemetery. William was also buried there upon his death on November 21, 1958, at the age of 93. Their second son, Arthur, was born on November 3, 1866. As he grew, he developed a deep and articulate speaking voice so that not only did he look dignified, he sounded it. Depending on how well you knew this well-dressed and well-educated man, you might call him Colonel, Plover, or just plain Arthur. He was widely known and liked in this part of the state through his work as a grain elevator auditor for Bingham Brothers and also a fur trader and successful farm owner in both Minnesota and Canada. Always looking for new challenges, he later bought and operated a hotel in Ada, Minnesota. The much older Arthur and his young bride, Edna Ashford of Seaforth, met while she was teaching school. After their wedding on January 3, 1912, they spent their 3-week honeymoon on a train speeding its way to St. Louis and Point South before returning to their Redwood Falls home. Arthur and Edna had no children, and unfortunately, due to the Depression and Arthur's ill health, they lost all but 1 or 2 of their small farms, which his brother James helped him salvage. They spent their last year living in the homes of John and Mary Goudy and Nat and Emma Goudy. This picture is of Arthur with his young nieces Hazel Goudy Flum and Doris Goudy Nelson at the Goudy farm. Arthur suffered from cancer for 1 year before his death on November 13, 1932 at the age of 66. Edna died on October 25, 1950. Arthur is buried in the Stanton Cemetery and Edna is buried at the Redwood Falls Protestant Cemetery. Then on September 30th, 1868, Francis Goudy was born. Like his brothers, Francis also attended Beeman College, and later he owned and operated the Canby grain elevator with his brother James. He also had an insurance business and farmed in Stanton, and in the Goudy tradition he belonged to the Oriental Lodge number 34. This is how Francis's home looks today. He married the former Luella Smith of Ruthton on August 5, 1896. They were blessed with 4 children, Arthur, Nellie, Gladys, and Evelyn. This is an early picture of Arthur and Nellie, the 2 eldest children of Francis and Luella. Here are all of Francis and Luella's children, along with the 2 daughters of Nathaniel Goudy. Back row is Nellie, Arthur, Gladys, and the front row is Evelyn and cousins Marie and Myrtle Goudy. This is Arthur as a soldier. He died after spending many years in a Red Wing nursing home. This is Nellie at a later age. She became Mrs. Harris Jacobson. She died at the age of 53 of cancer. Gladys became Mrs. Willard Kirchner and is now living in a nursing home. Here she is visited by some of her Goudy cousins. These are some of Gladys's descendants. Evelyn was the youngest child. This is her wedding to Ralph Whistler. They moved from the farm into town. This is the picture of the house they moved to in Cannon Falls. Francis served as Justice of the Peace in Cannon Falls for 20 years. In 1927, carrying out both popular and unpopular laws of the land, he once imposed a fine of $50 and costs to an unfortunate gent who was discovered by the local sheriff to be in possession of 99 pint bottles and 20 quart bottles of home brew. In his spare time, Francis sold grave monuments, and in 1928 he bought the movie theater from his brother James. Happily, Francis and Luella were able to celebrate their golden wedding anniversary in 1946, surrounded by 50 friends and relatives at Nellie and Harris's home, and were serenaded on the piano by granddaughter Marlis. Francis suffered a hip fracture and died in May 1952 at St. John's Hospital in Red Wing at the age of 84. Luella died of cancer on May 27, 1958 at the age of 83, and they are both buried at the Cannon Falls Cemetery. Son James was born January 15, 1871. He was a lifelong bachelor. James focused his life on being a successful businessman, and he also attended Beeman Actual Business College. He operated grain elevators in North and South Dakota. He was 37 years old in November 1908 while operating a grain elevator at Castleton, North Dakota. His right arm was caught by the cart puller when he was unloading a car of wheat. It was so badly mangled that it was necessary to amputate it below the elbow. After his accident, James came home to Minnesota, where he owned and operated this grain elevator in Stanton in 1911. James and his brother Francis owned an elevator in Canby, Minnesota also. The accident didn't prevent him from doing anything he wished, including driving his car all the way to California for a Rose Bowl game. Here is James in California in 1920. To accommodate the loss of his arm, James had his car modified in the English style with the steering wheel on the right. He owned and operated the Cannon Falls Theater. Being a very generous man and perhaps wishing to offset the somewhat unusual appearance of his black-gloved artificial hand, James delighted in passing out quarters and 50-cent pieces to the children who crowded around him. The prospect of a free pass to the movies and an ice cream cone afterward kept a happy gleam in his nieces' and nephews' eyes. He sold the theater to his brother Francis in 1928. James was an avid reader. In this picture, we believe he was in a play. He is the handsome fellow on the far left. Here is James with a group of young friends. He had many interests to keep him busy, and like the rest of the Goudy men, was a member in Oriental Lodge number 34. He also belonged to other organizations holding offices of trust. He enjoyed a good baseball game, picnics with his relatives, taking his relatives for rides and short trips, and listening to his pet canary sing. For a number of years, he had a room and board with a Mrs. Haig, and later moved to an apartment above his theater. In later years, he had a schoolhouse moved into town and used it for his home the rest of his life. James died at City Hospital in Red Wing after being confined there for 3 months. He was 87 at his death on April 27, 1958, and was buried at the Stanton Methodist Cemetery. The fifth child of Francis and Bridgettina was Annie E. Goudy. Annie was born July 27, 1873, and died at the age of 8 on September 26, 1881, of a bowel obstruction. Sadly, all other records or pictures of little Annie were lost in the fire which destroyed their home in 1887.
The summer's gone and all.
Farmer, salesman, hunter, amateur barber, baseball fan, and renowned popcorn vendor. This was Nathaniel, sixth child of Francis and Bridget, born on April 12, 1876. Brother James Goudy's theater had an upper-floor recreational hall and apartment where competitive card games were held. Nathaniel's hot buttered popcorn stand was on the sidewalk nearby, where the relatives would meet on Wednesday and Saturday nights to share the news of the week and plan Sunday picnics. These are pictures of the popcorn wagon when it was set up at Riverside Park. Emma Robinson was born on June 20th, 1880. She was 23 when she married Nathaniel at her home on December 30th, 1903, with the Reverend Luke of Stanton Methodist Church performing the ceremony. He blessed their union as they began their life together on the farm in Stanton Township, where they would live for the next 16 years. For Nathaniel, farming soon became a real headache, literally. He suffered from painful migraines, which made it very difficult for him to operate the farm, plus milk 40 head of cattle morning and night. This picture is of the stone barn on Nathaniel's farm. Today, the barn is almost gone after years of deterioration and also in being in a storm with strong winds. He had carved his name into one of the bricks. The fact that education of his children was all important to him made him decide to organize and help build District 166, the school his children Myrtle, Marie, and Nathaniel attended. To further their education, he moved his family to Cannon Falls in 1921. Later, Francis and Jim were born. This is the house that Nathaniel's family moved to in Cannon Falls as it looks today. A member of the Oriental Lodge number 34 in the Congregational Church, he was a man who enjoyed meeting people, so it was quite natural that selling would be a job that this gregarious, industrious man would seek. One day he set off for Lake City Nursery, brought home some stock, and began a career in sales that would last for many years to come. Months before his fatal heart attack, Nathaniel had a stroke. He died at his home on June 25, 1948, at the age of 72. Emma died on December 6, 1957, and they are both buried at Stanton. Francis, born November 11, 1914, was active in Demolayan 4-H. He tragically drowned in the Cannon Falls swimming pool on September 19, 1935, at the age of 21. Nathaniel died at the age of 45 from an embolism in 1955. He was married to Dorothy Doley. Nathaniel was an admired coach for baseball and basketball in Austin. Free-spirited would be an apt description of their seventh child, Marie, who was born on August 8, 1878. She was bright, generous, and kind-hearted, but it was her wonderful sense of humor that was her most obvious hallmark, because it was evident in the limericks she wrote, the jokes she told, and the many witty wisecracks she made. If she could have, she would have danced and sung her way through life, and probably to a slightly different drummer. And if there was a bargain to be found or a contest to be entered, Marie would be the first in line. She could have been called flighty, but managed to keep her feet planted firmly on the ground long enough to graduate from Cannon Falls High School. Once, while Marie was teaching in Eagle Lake, a tornado struck the schoolhouse and moved it off its foundation. Luckily, no one was hurt. Lloyd Burgess, her Prince Charming, swept her off her feet, and they were married on November 16, 1912. While she attended Eastern Star meetings, wrote her songs and limericks, and gave birth to their son Willard, Lloyd worked hard as an accountant at Swift & Company and dealt in real estate in St. Paul. Lloyd loved hunting and fishing and took pride in his cars. Marie and Lloyd lived in South St. Paul all their married lives. She was also a romantic, and so moved by the plight of those star-crossed lovers, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, that she wrote a song for them. It was entitled Tried Hearts, and she had Mrs. T.E. Forsyth of South St. Paul set it to music for her. Apparently the Duchess was also moved and quite impressed with Marie's talent, because she sent her a personal note acknowledging the special gift of music.
Scatterbrain and jitterbug, round you go on my fine rug. First you twist, and then you prance. You can't call that thing a dance. Come on, fella, take the stand. Try to get yourself in hand. Everywhere you go is heaven, and you stay there till 11. Out then you go to the street, pick up the first girl you meet. Have a drink, sis? Bet your life. Maybe she's another's wife. That don't matter, not a bit. For the present, she is it. So things go from bad to worse, from this jitter, and curse. Betty bought some butter, but she said this butter's bitter. If I put it in my batter, it will make my batter bitter. So she bought a bit of butter, better than the bitter butter. Put it in her bitter batter, made her bitter batter better. So it was better. Betty bought a bit of better butter.
Lloyd died of a heart attack in 1950 at the age of 63 following a collapse at his office. Lloyd is buried at Acacia Park Cemetery in Mendota Heights. Marie died at the Gergen Rest Home in Hastings in 1953 at the age of 75 and was buried at the Acacia Park Cemetery in Mendota. Their only son, Willard's interests were art and golf. He was at one time married and had one son, Craig. In 1987, he died of a heart attack in Texas. Robert, born on September 9, 1880, was a man of many interests and talents. His interest in vehicles was apparent as is seen in these pictures. Robert riding his Wagner motorcycle in 1910. Robert in his red Rio, one of the first automobiles in the area in 1910. With Robert were Ole Thorson, Elizabeth Goudy, Hattie Ahern, and Mrs. Lilliscove. Robert later owned his own car dealership selling Pontiacs and Oaklands around 1926. Between chews of tobacco, Rob closed many